What's going on, guys? Welcome to the video. It is Wednesday, August 28th, and I have a very special guest with me, highly requested, Dr. Pat Davidson. Pat, why don't you just give us a background on yourself? And I think a lot of people have been following you now that I've been posting a lot of movement-based stuff on Instagram, and a lot of the stuff that I share comes from guys like Kyle and Pat, and I've just been getting so many questions about, how to deal with a lot of the pains and injuries and stuff that come with powerlifting. And I thought there was no better person to talk on this than Pat, so
sure.
Take it away, man.
Sean, thank you so much for interviewing me here. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure, man.
My hope is that I can definitely be of help to you and to other people that are kind of in this community of wanting to be really strong and take care of their body in the process and be in it for the long run. But to kind of give like a little bit of a brief background on me, I've sort of been an athlete as long as I can really remember. I've kind of found my refuge through sports and competition and training. So training for me has been a big deal since I was in, 5th grade, 6th grade even. I kind of came up in a time of like watching movies like the Rocky movies and Bloodsport, and like there was just a part of me that always wanted to kind of go through that journey of sort of like immersing myself in a training experience and being on a mission for something. And eventually, like after I was done playing sports like baseball and football and even for me, mixed martial arts in my early 20s and late teens, I kind of got into strength sports, and my academics sort of merged with that, where I was going through a master's program in strength and conditioning and eventually a PhD program in exercise physiology, but simultaneously like getting deeper and deeper into personally training, trying to compete in Olympic lifting pretty badly, getting an education of powerlifting through kind of like a classical sort of West Side model, and then competing at a pretty high level in strongman. And now I'm kind of done with competing in strongman. I don't really compete in anything at this point. But I still train as if I'm trying to, go for the NFL Combine next year or something like that. So like training to me is always present in my life.
Yeah.
And being able to, for me, like understanding what's going on and how to optimize it is probably my life's journey and the thing that gets me most excited. And so I try to live it and learn it at the same time, and it always seems to amplify itself when it works like that.
That's awesome, man. So, guys, you heard all of that. This guy is one of the, honestly, leading experts, in my opinion, in exercise physiology, and he has developed an extensive knowledge on how to deal with a multitude of athletes. And for most of my viewers, most of you are either really competitive in powerlifting or just getting into it. And a lot of you have noticed that the playing field and the depth of talent in powerlifting has been growing massively over the years. And the level of competition demands an increased level of training and intensity in training. And the days of kind of the conjugate West Side, high variation powerlifting are kind of over. And the reason for that is how big and how deep the talent pool is in powerlifting. So kind of the landscape of training has become very hyper-specific, practicing the competition movements, low bar squatting, bench pressing, competition deadlifting, multiple times a week, pretty much all year round. And the reason we're here is to talk about kind of the side effects or the injuries and pains that kind of come along with training like this, especially for an extended period of time. The reason this was requested of me is that there's so many typical powerlifting injuries that come up that a lot of you have come to me about, who have sought out physical therapists and even doctors for. And a lot of times people just kind of accept that these nagging pains and injuries are going to persist throughout their entire lifting career. And I don't think that's worth accepting. And that's why we're here today, to talk kind of more about, why these powerlifting related injuries and pains come up. And then Pat can kind of give us more insight into what the root causes of this are and how powerlifting and the way that we train powerlifting today lends itself to those kind of injuries.
Yeah, and it's one of these topics that's kind of, it's always going to be multifactorial. And people in general want a simple story that takes a really complicated group of interrelated principles and merges it into one thing.
Yep.
And it's always like, for me, I feel like I have to burst people's bubbles of like, it's never one thing. It's never something that's one piece that's so simple that it clears up everything. That's not how life works. But overall, when I think about anything, I always think about like, is there more, like I'm always looking for the commonalities. And in particular, when you're dealing with populations, like powerlifters, like you think about that group. And a lot of times if you look at like the weight classes, the people that are going to do really well tend to look a lot like each other for the most part. You know what I mean? It's almost like in the NFL, like you kind of have to be this size and shape to dominate as a defensive end. And if you're grossly different from that size and shape, then you're probably not going to be able to dominate at that particular position. And in a lot of sports, it's a similar thing. It's like the process of finding out who the person is that's the fastest human in the world in sprinting is a natural selection process. And whenever you have an enormous talent pool for a given sport, like American football, for instance, it's a natural selection process to determine who's going to make it to this elite level of the NFL, and then who's going to even dominate at that level of the elite of the elite. Mm-hmm. And you'll typically see that there's like certain characteristics that are indicative and increase the likelihood that it's going to be this particular individual that expresses that. So when you think about power lifters, for instance, there's like, you know, certain sizes and shape that make sense for certain movements. You know, like you wouldn't expect to see the guy who's the best bench presser in the world to have super long arms and to be really good at like shooting sky hooks in basketball. You know, it's kind of like that's not the most likely shape and strategy that would really dominate in that realm. But the deadlift, for instance, could be something that like a longer person could do really well with based upon the leverages and the difference between it being a pulling exercise versus a squat, which is more of a pushing activity. But when you think about like the activities themselves and the ways that you would get better at those things, there's some very specific adaptations that would take place that are fairly homogeneous across the population that's performing these activities over and over again. And with anything, it's almost like if you go to the same well over and over and over again, eventually you're going to pull that bucket up and it's going to be totally dry. And that's almost how I think about, like, you know, we're driving these kinds of adaptations and changes to the body that for a while are leading you to be able to improve your performance, but eventually can create such a limited scope that now you've got such, you've created a problem out of what used to be the solution. And now being able to provide a new solution means going outside of that zone. You know, I've heard before people talk about, like, you know, you've got these simple periodization plans that work really well for beginners. And then the person's mind forms like this association with this program. You know, I love this program, I'm never gonna do another program because of the reward process that it gave you in the beginning. And it's like, well, you're just in love with a program that works well for beginners, but you've moved outside of that zone now, and now you need to find a different approach because what used to work for you in this particular type of setting no longer works because you're over here now. So it's always, I'm trying to get that across. Like, generally speaking, what's going to help people be able to lift more weights is to create a body structure that widens you out and compresses you from front to back. But at a certain point, that's going to come back and bite you in the ass because you've widened yourself out so far side to side and compressed yourself so hard front to back that now you've got nowhere else to go. And because if I just take a step back, we always talk about the morphological changes that take place to the skeletal muscle. You know, it's like we know so much about the science of hypertrophy and the science of what it looks like for a muscle to grow and changes in pennation angle and things like that. But what we've done zero of is studying the morphological changes and adaptations that take place to the shape of the skeleton. And to me, that's the critical piece, because anybody looking at the two of us can see that our shape is very similar. And you know, even the way that you do exercises, how do you lift more weight? You spread out. You know, I'm going to spread out my stance in the squat. I'm going to spread out my back on the bench. I'm going to spread out on the floor with my deadlift to be able to create the right state and environment to be able to move the most amount of weight. Okay, so your skeleton will change in that process as well, and it's using the exact same strategy. How do I make a more stable object that isn't going to go anywhere, that I can push something away from? And really, the solution to that is, let's take your skeleton and just make it wider side to side. And if I'm going to make it wider side to side, it's the same way I would do it with a tube of toothpaste. I got to squish it together from the front and the back at the same time, and that'll push the sides more laterally. And we'll discuss kind of like, when you see that happen, it's going to change the arms in a very specific way, and it's going to change the legs in a very specific way in terms of the way that they rotate and move through space. So my solution at this point of spreading everything out too far would be to try everything possible to crush it back in again towards the middle. And if we can get you to adjust and then create more adaptations from there, we'll just continue to go through this process of the skeleton kind of expanding in that direction, compressing in this direction, and then pushing it back together and pulling it back out that way. And there's some really simple ways to do it, and we'll probably be able to see that, number one, your joints will move a little bit differently after, and two, you'll feel a hell of a lot better and you'll be more ready and willing to train hard.
Sounds like a plan to me. So like I said, guys, the reason that we're making this video is that so many of you have sought help for your issues, right? There are a lot of you guys out there who want to eliminate pains, who want to move better, who are looking for a way to continue to elevate their performance in sport without encountering pain. And a lot of people encounter more issues as they, progress in their powerlifting career. The traditional things that you always see on social media are somebody putting a band around their knees because their glutes aren't firing properly, or some sort of tractioning or active release therapy, theragunning yourself, Graston, self-Grastoning. I've seen some people use like a spoon and some icy hot and try to dig at, muscle tissue. And I've spoken to very few people who have had these lingering sort of injuries that has actually been a successful method for. And, Pat just went into a very thorough explanation of kind of what kind of global changes happen to our body and our physiology through trying to get stronger and move more weight. And I just wanted to turn it over to Pat again to kind of explain in just a more succinct way of why these typical methods that we see, muscle doctors or physiologists, PTs on Instagram, or coaches who try to implement these, these remedies or these exercises, why they don't necessarily get the job done, and why they're kind of missing the mark and not really attacking the main problem.
So to me, most problems are matters of perspective. And perspective is determined by the angle that you're looking at something from and the distance that you're from that particular object that we're trying to analyze. And this is something that I've said before, and I like to go back to it over and over again. And in the beginning, I always try to tell things through analogy and like story rather than the direct, because it just helps you put your mind in the right place to be able to get the perspective needed for the specific topic we'll get to. But Sean, you're familiar with dogs, right?
Of course.
They exist. Canines are a species on this planet, and we've domesticated them. You ever put a dog in a room that it doesn't want to be in? Like, you put it in there.
I never personally have, but I have the image in my head
You've
now.
been in a place where someone's done this before. Like,
yes.
The dog, it's like, hey, he's barking. We're going to throw him in the room. We're going to close the door. Mm-hmm. And what does the dog doesn't want to be in there. Yep. He wants to be out. What does the dog want to have accomplished? The dog wants the door to open so that he can escape from that room. So what is the typical strategy that the dog goes with to be able to have the door open?
Start barking, scratching at the door.
That's what dogs do. And the funny thing is that a lot of times the door opens. So dogs begin to formulate this hypothesis that, the way that you open doors is barking and scratching. And that's actually the mechanism by which doors work. And, sometimes it's like they get put in the room and at first it doesn't work. But if they bark harder, or they scratch harder, or bark longer and scratch for more time, well, sometimes that opens the door too. And to me, when it comes to people trying to solve these movement problems and their pain issues, they remind me an awful lot of dogs trapped in rooms, thinking that the mechanism of door opening is scratching and barking. And dogs don't really understand anything about frames and hinges and levers and locks and knobs and swing. They simply have been creating this strategy to accomplish a task, and then sometimes the task happens, other times it doesn't, but sometimes they just try to hammer at it even harder with what they've been doing, and they get rewarded enough to begin to think that they've got the mechanisms down right. when in fact, what we really need to do is take a step back and examine the door itself and try to figure out the way that this thing works. And to me, it's like if we're talking about doors, the first thing we need to do is look at the ground and see, is the ground uneven? Because, oh, I tried to open the door, it didn't go, but actually I took a look back and this thing is like a totally uneven ground, so it just hits as soon as I try to open it. Or the frame is off, so when I try to open it, it hits. And it had nothing to do with, you thought it was the hinges because your perspective has only been one of someone that can examine hinges, and you've never been able to look back at it from a big picture standpoint, big enough to recognize all of these different levels. Like a surgeon would just shave off the bottom of the door, and they're like, hey, look, it swings again. No problem. That's the way I look at things. And I'm always wondering to myself, like, how much vantage point do I have on any given topic? And I'm always trying to be able to zoom in and zoom out. And when I'm able to do that and also admit to myself when I don't know a certain distance, that I have to find someone that is familiar with what things look like at this level of perspective and be able to outsource that problem and learn from that person about it. But when I think about a human body moving, it's like at its most primitive levels, like, because we're creatures that evolved into what we are today, and evolution started a long time ago, and the strategies evolution has been using haven't really changed that much. And when you think about movement of anything, you're always going to have it be driven by concentration gradients. And you need to sequester more of something over here, and it's always going to move downhill. So that's the way everything else moves or works as well. Like biology doesn't get to be unique and like its own little snowflake. It still has to follow the laws of physics. It just does whatever it can to try to manipulate that. So biology creates essentially like objects that try to contain material, and it creates barriers that are semi-permeable around its walls, so that a little bit of something can escape or get back in. And it's really being able to play with being able to move something and concentrate it over here, so that at a certain point in time, when the timing is right, it can move it downhill and create movement. It's the same thing if I'm talking about running or walking or trying to lift an object. I need to be able to sequester in one region to be able to drive something in another direction. And this ultimately comes down to the ability to compress and expand, compress and expand. And if you can begin to recognize whether a system is operating more in terms of a state of compression or more in terms of a state of expansion, now you can figure out from the most zoom back perspective possible, what exactly do I need to feed this system to be able to give it more of the opposite, that which it's not doing at this point in time. And generally speaking, when powerlifters get really strong and really good, they've learned how to compress really hard in a lot of places. And what they need is some degree of the ability to expand in certain directions. And thankfully, it gets a little bit easier if you understand some anatomy, because we can apply joint actions to express or describe these fundamental principles at their most basic element. Because everything is a matter of either compressing something or expanding something. Whether we're talking about a cell swelling with nutrients or being compressed to be able to push things out, whether we're talking about a heart receiving blood or pumping blood out, whether we're talking about lungs expanding as you inhale and compressing as you exhale, whether we're talking about a bicep compressing to be able to create a concentric state of an elbow inflection or an eccentric state and allowing it to expand and open. Everything follows these basic rules. And overall, if I recognize that someone is excessively compressed and needs to be able to experience a greater degree of expansion, I know that the joint actions associated with expansion are going to be flexion, abduction, and external rotation. But what's really interesting is that what a lot of people think of when it comes to those joint actions can be a little bit more mysterious than what they originally sort of prescribed to. Because a lot of times when people think that they're creating this external rotation and abduction of legs to be able to squat by pushing legs out, if I can examine it in relation to the pelvis, a lot of times when they're deep in a squat and abducting like crazy and externally rotating like crazy, in reality, they're in a state of being internally rotated. Okay? And, you know, it's always like I want to be able to accomplish a task from the best position associated with accomplishing that task. And one of the examples I give for that is, if I give you the task of making a fist as hard as you possibly can, you know, you choose to put your wrist in this position right here because it's going to be able to give you the right shape to be able to optimize that. Now, when it comes to like where things typically go wrong is when people go ahead and they try to put their wrist in this initial position of flexion, keep it in flexion, and then try to make a fist. Okay? It's like, wow, I feel a lot of muscle activation here, and this must be working really well on an EMG or something like that. But in reality, you're really not in a great place to be able to accomplish this particular task. And if I can give you the right starting place, you'll probably naturally and most optimally accomplish the task that you're shooting for. And that's really all I ever think about when I'm working with a population that's no longer able to do what it wants to do in the most natural and least high effort strategy possible. It's like, I know what it should feel like to squat and make the squat feel good, but it doesn't feel that way anymore. And all I can think about in my head is I'm going to give you the right starting position and shape to be able to have that sensation and feeling of, wow, this is what a squat should feel like, and this is how I should be able to execute this. And once you're in that state, now you are ready and happy and excited to be able to train again. And that's where you want to be able to really drive performance to the highest degree possible.
So you would say when these people get to a level of being advanced, they're almost lacking variability, right?
Yeah.
And you're wanting to take this step back and be able to say, all right, asshole, you've grooved all of this extension and external rotation. We want to now take a step back and give you that variability back so that your movement feels the way it used to before you've kind of dug yourself into this hole where you've exhausted, you know, all of this one resource and kind of narrowed yourself in this corner.
You know, you can only compress something well if it first expands. And powerlifting is the act of compression. It really is. It is an exhalation-based activity. And it's like, just think about it though, if you've compressed the ball to the point where it's flat, and now you keep trying to compress it,
it's not going anywhere.
You're not compressing anything. You're already compressed. I need to be able to refill you back up again so that you have something to be able to squeeze against now that you're, you know, because that's really what you're trying to do. So it's kind of like, you know, you've taken a ball and you flatten it out this way as much as you possibly can, and now your palms are practically touching. And that was a great way to be able to get you up to this place where you were able to compete at a very high level and perform at a world-class or near world-class level. But now you've compressed and you've gone to that well so many times, there just isn't anything left to compress and there's no water left to pull out of the well. So how do I just give you a little bit of something that can expand you back out? How do I put more water back in this well so you can go back to trying to milk it for everything you can? So it's like force got you into this situation and force can get you out of this situation. It just needs to be equal and opposite to some degree.
Absolutely. That's a great analogy. And lucky for you guys, what we're going to do now is we're going to do kind of a two-part demonstration for you guys. The first being we're going to kind of go through some more, you know, low threshold, low threat drills, whether on the floor or standing. Pat will kind of walk me through that to kind of help reestablish this variability and, like he said, kind of refill the well so that you can continue to milk it for all that it's worth. And then for those of you guys who, you know, want to implement this, but also, you know, you're at an elite level where, you know, you have a meet coming up in however many weeks and you need to continue to train hard, or maybe you're in a really important off season leading up to a big competition. You need to be able to work around some of the issues that you're getting from this lack of variability. Pat's going to show us some really awesome alternatives and variations of the big three movements that will allow you to accumulate a lot of volume, get the quality work in, but not necessarily continue to just narrow yourself into that corner and, like he said, squash that ball until your hands are practically touching. All right, guys, so like I said before, I'm sure a lot of you guys have gone to a PT's office and had some sort of table test or assessment done, and maybe it worked for you guys, maybe there was some valuable information that you gained from it, but I'm sure a lot of people have also gone through this and the intake of the information and then the analysis that was given out to you of what to do going forward might not have been clear, complete, or just might not have been correct. So what we're going to do now is Pat is going to, I think, run me through a table test assessment, and he's going to kind of walk through, you know, I would consider myself like the typical high-level powerlifter when it comes to kind of where my movement variability or lack thereof is, and Pat's going to kind of talk about what he sees during the assessment.
Yeah, so to me, we've got two types of movement. We've got flexion, abduction, and external rotation, and we've got extension, adduction, and internal rotation. And I just basically try to get a sense of which one of those two things are you lacking more than the other one. And the common thing is you probably are going to lack everything because everything's compressed from every possible direction to be able to try to lift as much weight as you possibly can. Mm-hmm. But there's probably some things that we can pick up that will give us a direction to try to go into. But overall, I would say most powerlifters are going to really benefit from a little bit more expansion and a little bit more of this kind of inhale, flexion, abduction, external rotation sort of thing, which again is oftentimes very different than the way that they think they're getting it. But we'll kind of explain that when we get there. But I'm going to put you up on the table here, Sean.
Yep.
And I'm just going to take a look at arms and legs and see what we've got for flexion, abduction, external rotation, and extension, adduction, and internal rotation. So you can lay on your back to start off with, and I'll just take a look at upper body and arms, and we'll see, like, from the right side perspective, if I take a look at flexion, like, number one, I got to make sure I put the person in the right position, which is external rotation, to be able to actually see what we've got. And, you know, flexion for you kind of ends somewhere about here. So we would definitely say that's not full. And then if you slide to that edge of the table, we'll take a look at rotation pieces. And we've got internal rotation, which is pretty good. We're getting to a pretty good degree here. External rotation is pretty equal to internal rotation. You can see his arm kind of hangs up right there. And if you come all the way towards me to the edge of the table right there, now what we'll take a look at is whether or not his arm can abduct and drop off the table here. And no, it cannot. So then I would just simply take a look at how well does his arm cross his body in this direction, and it doesn't really go anywhere. So again, like, we're lacking a lot of stuff in terms of, like, there's not a whole lot of flexion to really speak of. There's not a lot of abduction to speak of, and there's not a lot of adduction to speak of. So it's kind of like, again, like, where do we start from with that? It's sort of the question. But, you know, if I measure your other arm, and just so everybody can kind of see, I'll just have you spin around and have your head down at that end of the table. And we'll see what we've got over here. So again, flexion is going to go this way. And if I keep his arm actually in a good position of external rotation, it goes there. And, you know, if I allow him to internally rotate, it looks like we get a lot more, but that's kind of a phony test. I've really got to keep this arm in this position here to actually test its full flexion capabilities. And if I do that, we're ending right about there. If you slide over to that edge, we'll take a look at internal and external rotation. And we can see that internal rotation ends right about there. It can kind of push on it and it just springs right back. External rotation is much more promising on this side, but we don't know if that's really there. Like, again, flexion, abduction, and external rotation all ride together. So let's take a look at what we've got for abduction. Slide all the way over, and we'll kind of drop this arm off the side of the table. And again, it sort of doesn't really go very far. Like, a good one would be if it was down here somewhere at about a 45-degree position of abduction. And let's take a look at what we've got for adduction with the arm crossing the body. And again, not a lot. Like, you can see, I'd have to rotate your whole body to be able to get you there. If I just kind of pin that and see what the arm's capability is, not a lot. So just very limited motion in all directions, which is what I kind of expect. Like, in terms of, if you move back to the middle of the table, like, if you're under a barbell, you don't want to go anywhere. Mm-hmm. I don't want to rotate. I don't want to bend. I want to stay as rigid as I possibly can. And if I do that, if I drop off these degrees of freedom of motion, it's very likely that I'll just move the object that I'm trying to move in a straight line against gravity. So that's kind of the goal for you, is change your body so you can move objects in a straight line against gravity. And the less possible directions that your body can bend, the more likely it is that you'll squeeze yourself and press something in that direction. It's almost like if I want to drive the jelly of a jelly donut straight up, if I'm holding it vertical, I squish it, and that's the way the jelly's going to go. The jelly in your case is just a barbell. So if we squish you, boom, everything's going to go against gravity. So if I take a look at your legs, I'm probably going to see a very similar set of findings because your whole body is going to be using a very similar strategy. So I'm going to see how far can this leg flex, and I really have to do a good job of keeping it in line, and that's about it right there, okay? Like if I go any farther, I'm just moving the whole pelvis at that point in time. So where we should be able to get is that the thigh should basically be able to get all the way up in contact with the chest, okay? We're not remotely there, so flexion is not really there. If I take a look at external rotation and internal rotation, I've got about 10 degrees, 15 degrees of IR, and I got about 25 degrees of ER. I should have 60 degrees of ER, and I should have about 45 degrees of IR, so they're both pretty limited, okay? If we flip you around the other way so that we can see this, it's probably going to be a very similar set of findings on this side as when I try to flex his leg. Again, it's not touching his body. I don't have full flexion. If I try to test for internal rotation, we got about 10, 15 degrees. If I go for external rotation, I got about maybe 30 or 40 degrees. It's limited in all directions. But it's kind of like my hypothesis here is that we're going to need to expand you to be able to get some of these motions to pick up. And again, kind of like what I was talking about in terms if I squeeze a toothpaste tube from the front and the back towards the middle, I'm going to push everything laterally, which is the strategy that powerlifters go with anyways. I'm going to widen out on the bench, I'm going to widen out on the floor, I'm going to pull the bar apart. You know, the skeleton is going to go through the exact same series of changes. And, you know, like I said, if force got you in here, we can use force to get you out of there. And personally, I like to be as lazy as I possibly can to be able to accomplish the greatest amount that I possibly can. And to be able to do that, you know, I've kind of got this solution over here, but I want to show, like, just so that it's visually very obvious, like one last little measurement with the legs. And I'll have you go into side lying.
Which side?
You're going to be on this side first,
okay.
But we'll show both. But I got a feeling that this leg, neither of them is going to go up very high here. Okay, so we go to right about there with this side. And if you break dance and put your head down this side, we'll take a look at where this one goes to. And again, probably about the same degree of motion over here, right? So we'll see, like, and again, that's abduction. Like if I'm going to test your ability to extend your femur, I'm going to bring it back like this, and it's not making it all the way. Like if I let go, it just hangs there in space like this. So it can't really adduct and it can't really abduct. It's sort of lost in the middle. And if you break dance one more time, we'll take a look at how well the other one adducts. So you're going to be side lying, still facing that way. And I bet you this leg's going to look just like the other leg in terms of its ability to, and again, it's just going to hang there in space. It's almost like gravity's not enough to bring this thing down because it's just not in the position. I can push on this and it's like pushing on a brick wall. It's just going to bounce up and down there, where it should be able to just go down and hit the table pretty easily. So again, like I formulate my hypothesis here that we're just a very squished human and we're going to de-squish you by squishing you in the other direction. So I'm just going to bring it right over to the floor here. And if I lay you down on your back, you're going to be facing out that way.
So I'm going to be...
Yeah, you can be right there. That's perfect. And I'm just, like I said, force got you in here. Force will probably get you out of here. So I'm going to put this right here on the side of your hip. And you'll know, like, does that feel like it pushes the side of your hip straight down into the ground?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay. And I can adjust it a little bit if it feels like it's off center. This is an 80-pound vest. This is a 50-pound sandbag. So total, I have 130 pounds just sitting straight down on his hip. And again, I'll put it in kind of this setup where if I'm by myself, it'll just sit nice and easy. Of course, it's not doing that and being cooperative.
You can push it up a little higher.
A little
There we
bit
go.
higher.
Yep, perfect. There we go.
So right there, now it's balanced. And it should just press straight down on him. It should be literally squishing his pelvis from the sides towards the middle. You know, again, kind of picture this tube of toothpaste. If the toothpaste got pushed laterally because the front and the back got squeezed together, now I'm just taking the sides and I'm squeezing them towards the middle. And quite honestly, like when I'm doing this on my own, I can do this for 5-10 minutes, no problem. I'll just get to the point where I'm kind of uncomfortable and it's been there for a while. You know, when I'm at home and I have any kind of issues, I can even just be watching TV with my wife and she can sit right on the side of my hip or even on my rib cage or something like that, because chances are by kind of de-squishing me from this laterally pushed out direction, I'm going to gain some of this motion back and I don't have to put too much cognitive energy into it. Quite honestly, if I'm a competitive powerlifter, all I really want to think about and do is the things that are going to make me better at that sport, which are going to be more of the sport itself. It's just when the sport itself and training for it has put you into this place where you can no longer do it without negative ramifications, we just have to give you the opportunity to be able to go back and do more of that again without the problems that you're incurring. The side effects sometimes can be so problematic that you're not able to continue to drive the primary actions that would lead you towards improving your quantitative results for the outcomes that you're looking for. So as I'm just trying to buy some time here and kind of go back through these things, like, you know, do you just feel sort of like the outside of this down hip pushing into the ground pretty strongly?
Yep.
I mean, that's what I'm going for here. And again, like, I can continue to sort of push into you here and you feel more of that,
Oh,
correct?
yeah.
Like,
yep.
you know, we've really put a lot of force into these with some of the guys that train here and work here, and like, it seems like the more force you put in some ways, the better the outcome really becomes. So, you know, I would ideally leave you here for even longer, but, you know, what I want you to kind of notice is just sort of like, if you feel that this is really creating solid pressure on the side of your down hip, and you feel like this is really crushing you to the middle, then it's accomplishing what we really want here. And you know, the things that I'm always curious about is like how something like this could affect the motion of the arms, and what you find is oftentimes it really does. So, I don't know, you've probably been down here for maybe like 3, maybe 4 minutes by this point.
Yep.
So we'll see if this is enough time to be able to change the way that we have your joints actually positioned and moving. So I'll take this stuff away, and if you want to hop back up on the table.
Which side do you want me on?
You're going to be on your back. And again, like, I'll just go through some of the same motions. I'll see, do we have more range of motion? And you can probably tell and see that he's got substantially more shoulder range of motion just simply by squeezing his hips closer together. Okay? Let's see about his internal rotation if you want to go to that direction a little bit. You know, now all of a sudden he's got full shoulder internal rotation. We increased that by about 20 degrees from that. In terms of his external rotation, he's flat and on the table completely. Okay? If you slide all the way over and even a little bit more right there, we'll see if this increased his abduction. Okay? So, you know, it's sort of like, and again, adduction, let's see what we've got here. And he's all the way to the middle of his body with this. So you can kind of see, like, and again, I don't like to cheat these things. Like, let's just kind of position, put your head down the other end, lie on your back. We'll see if we've kind of changed some of the abilities of his leg to be able to go through the zone. So now all of a sudden he's able to get his hip into significantly more flexion than it was before. Like, he's almost at a point now where he can touch his thigh all the way to his chest. In terms of looking at his internal rotation, we're now at a place where you've probably got about 40 degrees. In terms of external rotation, you're probably around 50 degrees. And I would just bet you if we continued to measure joints around his body that we would see those kinds of changes take place. Now, like, the one thing I do want to clear up here is just the confusion that we get about what's happening during a squat in terms of internal and external rotation of your legs. Because sort of like the ability to get into a good solid position for a powerlifting squat to reach depth is probably the act of your femurs internally rotating. Where a lot of people think that, oh, I'm pushing my knees out, I'm spreading the floor, I'm creating abduction and external rotation. in reality, what you're doing is once you're in this zone here, to be able to get more depth, you're actually internally rotating your femurs and creating adduction. And there's a very simple way to be able to demonstrate this. And if you don't mind kind of helping me with being able to show this to people.
For sure.
But you know, first I want to just see like what's the position you'd get in for a competition squat. So we got the feet out there, and could you kind of show the motion you'd be going through to be able to create that? All right. And how does that feel even after we did the stuff on the with the ground? Like,
it actually feels a lot better. I've been having kind of this pinching feeling on the inside of my left hip, and I don't really feel it as.
I mean, that's again, like I'm always looking for it. Did we actually create that? And so it sort of looks like you're pushing your legs out, you're creating sort of ER to be able to accomplish this. Like what I want you to do is, if you can get into a kneeling position with your legs at that same width, and try to get the tops of your feet on the ground if you can, like where the shoelaces of your shoes would be. So yeah, just like that. And then sort of like sit back into kneeling. It's much easier for people to be able to see this from this position, that the more he sits down and back, which would be the equivalent of squatting in this particular case, and go ahead, sit back up and then come back down, his thighs are trying to internally rotate to accomplish that movement of his hips trying to sit down and back to be able to get there. His legs are abducted, but they're actually, for him to squat deeper, having to internally rotate and adduct to accomplish that task. If you don't have enough femoral IR, there's no way that you can squat and get down to a competitive depth and be able to get all white lights for that particular lift. So being able to see it here is really helpful for people, and ultimately if you had full IR of your femur, you would probably be able to sit the hips all the way to the ground there, and that ability to go through the zone for being able to get white lights and depth would be super easy. But so it's sometimes like what you think you're seeing isn't actually what's taking place anatomically. And ultimately, again, if we can zoom out to the point where we're so far removed and looking at things from a super global perspective, we can start to see just that the enormous shape changes that take place to the skeleton as a result of the activities that we take place in or that we participate in. They just create these overall general strategies of either expanding excessively or compressing excessively. And 99.99 times out of 100, when it comes to a power lifter that's reached a high level, they've gone to that compression well so hard and so far that it's as dry as the Sahara Desert. So I want to show you one of the most actionable tests from the table to be able to translate over to the training process for powerlifters. And this is going to be taking a look at how much hip extension somebody has. And I think the best position to do that is from a side-lying position, because you have much more ability to be able to see what's happening with the pelvis, with the body, and then see how much actual motion the femur has from the perspective of it being able to go into extension. So to be able to do this test, I'm first going to put the person into a 90-90 position while they're lying on their side. So I'm going to move your legs up just a little bit more. And by doing that, I make his pelvis about as straight on as it can get. Now I'm going to move your body so that it's in a straight line above it. So right there, I just want to see that there's pretty close to a straight line from like shoulder to hip. I'm still going to bring you back just a hair more right there. I want to make this about as authentic and true a test as I possibly can. So I'm going to block the pelvis from being able to move forward like this or back like that, because sometimes that kind of motion can really cheat the results and you don't know what you're looking at. But I'll simply do that by putting my hand right on top of his hip here and my thumb right back here so that I can control whether he's going forward or backwards rotationally. Now from here, I'm just going to scoop under his shin bone right up by his knee, and I'm going to bring his leg through this arc of flexion, abduction, and external rotation. I'll keep it there as we come back. Now he's already pushing into me pretty hard, which tells me that he's trying to do other things instead of pure extension of his femur to get back here. But this is about where it ends. Anything more, and you could probably see his foot drag there on the foot that's down on the table. If I go farther back, it's just his back extending, his hip pushing back into me like this, which you can see very clearly there. If I keep his hip pushed so that it's even, you can see exactly that he's not able to get his leg all the way into full extension, which would be his knee making it to somewhere right about here, which would be even with his hip in this plane right here and his shoulder right here. This is the point where his knee would have to reach to say that he's got full extension. Now, what this means to me is that when I'm looking at this test and I'm thinking about how this translates to the sport as powerlifting, I'm picturing him actually lying down on a bench and bench pressing. Okay, so what is the length of his tibia from the position where it is right here to where the foot is right there? Is this a position where he's actually able to get his foot flat on the ground, or at least some part of his foot on the ground, while he's staying on the bench? Otherwise, in order for him to be able to get his foot onto the ground, which is probably somewhere about here, he has to resort to some other compensatory joint action. Maybe it's driving the pelvis anteriorly into a big anterior pelvic tilt. Maybe it's creating excessive compression in his back. It's probably just something that's not optimal from a desirability standpoint of tissues not breaking down. So if I see that this is somebody whose extension ends here, and that's, I would just simply look at this angle of his femur compared to the rest of his body, and I would say that he probably lacks somewhere around 25 degrees of hip extension. I would put him, if I'm looking at him from the side while he's on a bench press, I might want to build the ground up under his foot so that I keep his femur in this exact same angle so that I don't need to drive any unnecessary and potentially further compressive and just motions that would wear him down unnecessarily when all he's trying to do is practice and increase the ability of him to be able to press weight away from his body. So again, this test tells me how much hip extension he truly has. It gives me an angle of how far I can get his leg towards hip extension, and it gives me an idea of how much I might have to build up under his foot to make the ground come to a point where his leg is at an angle that's actually authentic hip extension, so he doesn't need to resort to compensatory actions.
All right, guys, so what we're going to go through now are two different movement variations for the bench press and the squat that you guys can ideally utilize during your off season to kind of continue to get your volume in, build a nice foundation for the training block that might come for a prep, but not really beat yourself up as much if you're just hammering away hyper-specifically at the competition lifts multiple times a week.
Yeah, you know, to me it's sort of like in an ideal world you would be able to train specific all the time and just continuously progress volume and intensity, because that's what sports science would tell you is the answer. But there's so many logistical problems that come along the way. Like, good luck, try to do that in a linear fashion and never stop with that, because at some point in time something is going to come along and bite you in the ass. You know, it's kind of like it could be a mechanical problem, it could be a lifestyle problem. I don't know exactly what the huge limiter is going to be for somebody, but I do have some pretty simple mechanical fixes so that you can continue to train about as close to 100% specific as possible, but at the same time change it with just a couple of tweaks so that we can not completely thrash the same joints in the same direction constantly. Because as you progress in your career, it's going to just eventually kind of wear away at you. It's almost like smoking in some ways. Like, you can probably smoke for a couple of years and there's not these huge observable problems, and you can come to this conclusion that, like, hey, I'm just fine, like, I'm doing all right. But you continue to do it for 20 years, and now all of a sudden it's like you've been chipping away at the side of that mountain with a little, like, pick hammer, and after enough time and enough exposure to this continuous force, now we've got ourselves a problem. So, you know, we tested the degree of femoral extension that you have on the table, and I look at it as like, how does this apply and come across the board to when you're laying down on a bench? So if you don't mind just kind of getting into position, laying on the bench, and I'll give you the barbell so that we can really simulate this to the greatest degree possible. So here we go, like, and what we're seeing here is, to me, when I'm looking at him from the side, it looks like he's in a position of femoral hyperextension, but I tested him on the table, so I know that there's actually no way that he could get there from pure movement of his femur, and I would be willing to bet the farm that if I tried to put my hand under his lower back, that, oh, you don't even have to adjust, you're trying to go there, I can go all the way through even without him trying to change anything. So I know automatically for him to just try to get his feet on the ground, he had to take his whole pelvis and orient it anteriorly to be able to accomplish just the simple task of getting his feet to the ground. So my solution to something like this is I'm just going to bring the ground up to him. So if you don't mind picking your feet up off the ground for a second, there's one set of ground coming in under you, and here's another set of ground coming in under you. And now if I'm looking at him from the side, what I see is that his femur is now not quite in full extension, and that's where his femur lives anywhere. And I didn't really ask him to do anything, but now there's a lot less space right there. And he can still bench press in the same way like a powerlifter would want to in terms of being able to direct the sternum forward. He just doesn't have to compensate as much through his pelvis to be able to do this. And I'm probably just gonna save his lower back for forces that'll be encountered during deadlifting and squatting. It's kind of like bodybuilders have figured out that in order to be able to accumulate as much volume as possible, you limit the degree of axial loading to a certain degree. And I'm just trying to save his axial loading for his squatting and his deadlifting and not try to make it happen in every single exercise, particularly this one where it doesn't have to happen. So very simple solution, and at any point in time you can go ahead and take the ground away and make it farther away and resort to having to go into that pelvis being tipped forward state. But I'm just trying to spare you a little bit more time. It's almost like I'm throwing you a little bit of a life raft, and you can bring yourself to some life support in the meantime so that you can go back and kind of drown yourself in the future and get a little bit more of bench numbers to go up. Okay, so we're gonna now take a look at the back squat and just sort of take a look at like where his arms are in space. And you know, like you compete with a low bar position, I would imagine, and probably anybody that's good does as well. Like it's just a more advantageous position to lift the greatest amount of possible weight. But go ahead and put it in a high bar position for me. And all I'm trying to look at here is like the amount of internal rotation that we're creating with your humerus. And just go ahead and put it back in a low bar position. And I think that what we're seeing is the more that you go low bar, the more you're internally rotating your humerus. Go back into high bar, and you can see the elbows come more under. Basically, when the elbows come more under, you're externally rotating. And when you go back to low bar, the elbows go more back, internally rotating.
Yep.
Now, bench press is all about internally rotating the arms, okay? Just look at people that bench press a lot. You know, they're kind of like this. A bench shirt literally puts you there. It's going to internally rotate you. So if we're internally rotating while we're benching, and we're internally rotating all the time while we're squatting, guess what's gonna happen? Your shoulder is eventually going to hurt, probably right in the front, and you know, it's kind of like everybody's blaming their bench press for driving shoulder pain, and nobody's taking a look at the low bar back squat position that people are constantly doing and saying, hey, maybe it's this combination of always being internally rotated all the time that's contributing to this kind of stuff. Now, I don't want to use the rinky-dink bands and the pull-aparts and the things like that that aren't really a major impact activity, because how could that compare with like the forces that you encounter of a bar being on your back that you're internally rotating against, and how could that compare with a max bench press? It's just not enough. So what I try to do is I try to give you a position to be able to squat in that doesn't drive as much internal rotation. So I'll swap bars with you. I'll take this one out, and I'll put this one in. So I'll help you get into this guy. And what we can see here is that this bar gives you a really nice, easy position of being in much more external rotation compared to here. And if we just maintain this, like you can just go ahead and squat like, other than the fact that we move the hands from being out here in an internally rotated state to being here in an externally rotated state, it's still a squat. It's not that much different. And I think that this is just simply going to spare a lot of things that people aren't currently looking at and blaming for driving some of the pathologies and problems. Because honestly, I want you to train as specific as possible, as much as you can, as long as you can, because that's going to give you everything that you want.
No,
but
absolutely.
if I could just buy you a little bit more training that isn't constantly smashing tissues that don't need to be smashed in the process, I think I'll probably extend your career longer. And if we do that, you'll probably reach peaks that you wouldn't have hit otherwise.
No, absolutely. For those of you guys who are looking to stay in the sport for a long time, it often is daunting or sometimes even discouraging when you're going through something like this and seeing somebody continuing to train their low bar squat. They're constantly PRing, they're making a lot of progress on the lift, and that's what drives a lot of people to continue to push hyper-specific work. And doing an exercise like this isn't even just about the longevity, it's also that you'll be able to, you might not be able to use as much weight on a transformer bar or any other SSB bar as you would in a competition squat, but you'll be able to accumulate more volume, you'll be able to get the quality work in for your legs, which is what you're wanting to strengthen during your squat, during an off season. You're not going to beat up maybe your pelvis and cause that SI joint pain or knee pain that you might get from a low bar squat. You might not cause as much pain to your shoulders that you're accumulating from constantly low bar squatting and bench pressing. And ultimately, you're building this foundation and increasing your work capacity during the off season in a way that you wouldn't be able to if you had to drop back to low bar squatting once a week and ultimately doing less work for the sake of being stubborn and wanting to stick to that comp specific movement. All right, guys, so that's it for our video. Thank you guys so much for watching. We covered a ton of information today, from addressing what powerlifters typically go through with kind of pigeonholing themselves into the same typical 3 movements over and over again, how to interpret the feedback from table tests and other assessments. Kind of a really, really awesome drill, because I know a lot of you guys don't want to do things that are overly complicated, especially when you're drained or beat up from a lot of the stuff that you're doing for your powerlifting training. So Pat gave us a really easy way to kind of, well, Pat, let me ask you, how would you explain what we did on the ground there with the side lying?
Yeah, so, again, like I go back to, it's going to be the same rules. You're either going into more of a compressive state or a more expanded state. And again, like I would say that if you are a powerlifter and you're any good at the sport, because there's probably lousy powerlifters out there who are not super compressed, but if you're good, you're compressed as hell. And any degree of expansion I can give you anywhere is probably going to make you feel better and give you the ability to go back and train a little more. And it's almost like, what direction are you most likely compressed in? And the most likely direction is you're squished from the front to the back, which makes you wider side to side. So anytime I put you in side lying and I just crush you, it's probably going to help you in terms of being able to
front to back, right?
Yeah, I'm just going to expand you front to back. So when I think about expansion as an overall strategy of movement, there's, again, flexion, abduction, and external rotation all ride along with expansion. And when I think about how I can spare someone from the perspective, because I don't want to give you a million stupid little drills on the ground that are annoying and probably don't nearly come close to the forces you encounter in your sport. And it's then you're like this weird guy in the gym blowing up balloons and kind of like doing funky, weird-looking bridges and all sorts of stuff. That's not really what I picture powerlifters doing, and I don't think it's nearly enough. So it's always like, how can I take these concepts and actually put them into the lifts themselves so that you can continue to train specific, but in a way that will buy you a little bit of expansion. And again, like I think about the safety squat bar and how it's putting you in external rotation of the humerus. I think about like a Swiss bar and how that would put you in external rotation of a humerus so that you can continue to press. Or dumbbells having the ability to go in this direction. And I also could think about like, why do people squat better and easier if I put them on a heel wedge and elevate their heels, or give them Olympic shoes? Because it puts you in plantar flexion, which is all part of like flexion, abduction, and external rotation. It's just that concept applied at the level of the ankle. So if I understand the associations of those 3 movements and how they play out, I can just simply modify your competition exercises in a way that buys you a little bit more of this expansion phenomenon, so that you can train in a more pain-free and closer to just easy manner and still accumulate a tremendous amount of training volume.
Absolutely.
And build like muscle mass and a frame underneath you to be able to, once you go back into your competitive season, really go specific and be able to probably accumulate more volume because your fitness is so high. So yeah, I mean, what drives me crazy is like when people try to go off the deep end and do little rinky-dink drills that are not nearly the equivalent of your sport and what your sport's going to put you through. It has to be close to the forces and the durations and the velocity to which you will be encountering in your sport itself for it to have any kind of effect. So even with like, if you don't have a transformer bar or a safety bar, like Zercher squatting, and being able, because that's going to put your arms in this externally rotated position.
Yep.
And you're still squatting, and you're going to be able to maintain a really good skeleton in that position.
Yeah.
Like a heel elevated Zercher squat is going to be a big difference maker for some people that felt like they couldn't move. And again, side lying activities are big if you're going to be doing core work. I would say if you are a power lifter, there's probably no need, if you're at this stage where you're elite and you're compressed and you're just struggling to be able to do motions that don't hurt, don't do any more straight down planks, but do the hell out of some side planks, because gravity by itself is going to crush you back together. And if you can recruit the muscles on the sides to squeeze you together like an accordion, it'll go a long way to restoring some joint activities. So you just have to think about it from a shape perspective and less about it from the perspective of like me staring at an elbow that's bothering you, because that elbow is probably doing some stuff it shouldn't do because the shape of your chassis has now become really just kind of abnormal from the standpoint of what a human being should be shaped like.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's kind of abnormal for human beings to move barbells that weigh as much as we do, but who wants to be normal anyways?
Yep. No, for sure. Guys, this has been a pleasure. So first of all, thank you so much, Pat. This was amazing. I learned a lot through a lot of the assessments and what Pat has been talking about. I hope you guys can learn a lot from this. There's a ton of information. Luckily, YouTube, you can pause, replay, go back to things. I hope you guys learned a lot from this. I hope you guys can implement a lot of the principles, kind of how to interpret the feedback you get from watching your own movement or having some sort of assessment done on you, and then ultimately plan and structure your training in a way that allows you to progress pain-free. And again, like we said, it's okay to kind of take the step back and work on these variations and not be afraid that you're going to lose ground on the competition movements, because if you can kind of reestablish that variability, you can lift pain-free, accumulate volume. Like we said, you will have a much higher base and a much higher chance of success of staying healthy throughout a training block once you transition back into prep. So Pat, for those of you guys who don't know, we are currently in New York right now. Where can we find you if we want to drop in at your gym and learn some stuff?
So this is Hype Gym Union Square. I think it's the best gym in New York City. We got the best personal trainers going anywhere. If you are a personal trainer and you're in New York City, you can always drop in on our Wednesdays at 1 o'clock. I do a free education session for people that are in person, and that education session is recorded every week. We put it on our Hype Gym Patreon account, which you can find through my Instagram bio link. I also teach recurring seminars that are right now going around the country as well as going international. So I've got one coming up, Austin, Texas, September 14th, 15th, Montreal, Canada, September 21st, 25th, Queens, New York, October 5th and 6th, Scottsdale, Arizona, October 20-something, I think it's the 25th and the 26th. I'm doing one in San Francisco in November and booking one in London for April, hoping to do a couple in LA as well, just trying to find the right fit. But those seminars are going to be coming around. I've got the Mass and Mass 2 books that are training. They're not powerlifting specific, but for people just looking to get jacked and stay athletic, it's kind of like geared towards that. And the Rethinking the Big Patterns book is in the works.
Very excited
as
for that.
well as the video Rethinking the Big Patterns exercise database, which is going to be a monster for people that want to learn the specific kind of exercises that would be very much like specific to certain planes and stances and sporting drills and things of that nature. That is a monster of a product that'll be coming out pretty soon. So for people in particular that work in fitness and strength and conditioning, really good solid product there.
I'm definitely very excited for that, guys. Again, like I said, thank you so much, Pat. Thank you guys for watching. Remember, no bad days, and I'll see you guys in the next video.
Cool.
Awesome, man. That was great.
Yeah, that was.
Thank you so much.